One side is filled with a very hot gas, and the other is filled with a cold gas. After a certain amount of time, what will happen? I thought and answered correctly. The two sides would become the same temperature, neither hot nor cold, both would be warm. Exactly. This was the idea of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, that the hot and cold would mix naturally with time, that everything moves toward an equilibrium. Now imagine that both sides are the same temperature, but in each there is a mixture of hot and cold gases. What happens as time passes? Nothing, I said, and I was right. Now imagine, my mother continued, a small creature like yourself sitting on top of this box. You are able to observe all the molecules inside moving and to open or close a door, letting only the faster, hotter molecules through, so that as time passes, one side gets hotter and one side gets colder. This creature was Maxwell's demon. Of course, she went on to explain, it was simple to solve this paradox. Maxwell's demon changed the nature of the isolated system by joining it and increased the entropy of the system by processing and storing the information gathered about the moving molecules. Gathering information, too, was a kind of irreversibility. But imagine if such a mechanism could be created. Imagine if a true Maxwell's demon could be manufactured. It would give physicists the tools to manipulate and thus truly understand time. You get to decide which way you want time to run, she said, pointing at my chest. I thanked her for the costume and left. For a few years, we'd had a television in our living space. My mother had found it abandoned in the grocery store parking lot, rewired its insides to teach me about circuits and electric waves. What the grainy images taught me instead, while I was home alone after school, with the blinds down so nobody could see and tell social services, were the manifold things one could desire. Toys, clothes, microwavable snacks, toastable waffles and pizza pouches, cars, trucks, a certain way a person should look. So the television had taught me shame. Standing in the free lunch line with fish sticks and soggy green beans and a paper carton of milk that made me ill, I envied the beautiful girls with silky blonde and brown ponytails who sat together with their lunch boxes and brown paper bags, so happy. I had seen their yellow-haired mothers on television in pastel clothes, smiling as they packed lunches with Jif, Oreos, Lay's, Capri Sun, Chips Ahoy. At the door of the new friend's house, I took off the weird headband and pulled my hair into a high bun. I muttered to the television mother that I was Mulan. Poor thing, she said. She must have seen the tears I was blinking back. She led me to her room and rifled through her drawers, finally extracting a colorful silk scarf that she tied around my waist in an odd sash and a paper folding fan the friend's older sister had gotten in Japan while studying abroad. My new costume did not look like Mulan's or even particularly Chinese, but everyone was satisfied. My face was the costume. It was enough. But before this staged humiliation and triumph, before I left my house and knew to feel ashamed, there had been a moment when I stood in front of my mother and felt sheer power in my hands. My mother was looking at me as if I had actually transformed into her impossible thought experiment, as if I were indeed a creature of multitudes and mysteries, capable of overturning the laws of physics and making my own. My mother's body was too small underneath the white sheet. I looked at its shape and seemed to traverse this distance of years. Suddenly, I felt as I had then. I felt my mother looking at me in hunger as I wore the costume of infinite power. For a moment, everything almost made sense. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy that you read that particular passage. It's one of my favorites in the book, and I think it so wonderfully sets up, Sulan as, a woman of mystery and of brilliance, as somebody who can have an entire book orbiting around her, even as she's missing from the center of it. And so what I really love that you managed to capture in this childhood moment already is that sense of orbit that Leah already feels around her mother, and the questions that she has that have never been answered, in part because they've never really been asked. And my first question kind of resonates off of that mystery, because Leah ends up essentially journeying back to Shanghai in order to find out what compelled her mother to travel across an ocean in the first place. And oftentimes that immigrant story that's most often told is, immigration for the sake of the next generation, right? We did it for the children, we did it for you. But what I've come to understand is that there is an equally obvious, but much less talked about story, which is immigration for the self, for one's own ambition. I came here to make something of myself, to give myself a new chance to succeed. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you were hoping to explore in setting your character off on a journey to understand her own mother's ambitions.
Yeah, I love the way you put that question. I hadn't actually framed or thought about those differences in the way that you just said, but I think that's totally true. Often, I think ultimately, whenever anyone makes a decision, it's driven by the self, right? I think of agency as always like existing at a locus point where so many different factors are meeting, and those factors sort of like create the different paths on which you can act. And some of this, it might be history or your children, but ultimately you're the one who decides, which path you go down. In terms of what you were saying about about being interested in writing a character who, is very ambitious, right? And sort of like magnetically enigmatic. I've always been drawn to characters like that in literature myself. So one of the more obvious examples, classic examples is, Great Gatsby, right? It's clearly a very successful setup for a story where you have someone who wants so badly to be something. And the other thing I love about Great Gatsby is that you have someone who's standing off to the side, who's narrating and watching. So there's a sort of lens with which you can approach that story. And some of the more contemporary examples are Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. When I read those novels, I just thought, I haven't been this drawn to a character, Lila, since, I don't know, like I was a kid reading Harry Potter. And so I thought a lot about what made her interesting and enigmatic. And I sort of really admired and loved that Elena Ferrante wasn't afraid to write a brilliant, ambitious woman. And when I was starting to try to write, I had such a hard time writing women, and especially young women, because I think I hadn't grown up reading their voices in a way that resonated with me or that felt completely true to me. And so, when I sort of made that decision to be like, okay, I'm going for it. I'm going to write a brilliant, ambitious woman. And actually it's going to be a really fun thing to do.
And I think that you've absolutely pulled that off. And in pulling it off, you also essentially create this paradox, because, Sula never gets her own she never has her voice heard, essentially, except through the perspectives of your three main narrators. And as a result, you know, by always having their perspective covering her up, you end up learning so much more about what each of these characters desire, what shames them, what, you know, drives them, simply through how they react to this brilliant woman. And so even as she becomes perfectly fleshed out, ultimately she's still a complete mystery, because this is the trap that the novel sets up for itself. And it's the trap of just existing in the world, stuck in your own perspective. And so I wanted to, you know, ask a little bit about that, just kind of the way that you thought of the structure that you come up with, because your first page starts off in a third-person perspective. It's a nurse who works in the maternity ward on the day of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and it is a expansive, chaotic, you know, slightly absurd perspective. At one point, you know, she has to grab all these newborns and put them in a medical cart in order to roll them to safety. And then after, you know, that perspective ends, suddenly we switch entirely into these first-person perspectives that are much more intimate, much more internal and retrospective. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about what kinds of expectations you were setting up with such a different beginning to kind of the rest of the novel, and maybe what you were hoping to do to the reader in setting those expectations.
Yeah, what an incisive observation. So the way I opened the novel, I saw it very much as like, you know, a bird's eye perspective, an omniscient narrator that was circling and circling and circling until it landed on someone. And then we would follow that person for the opening. I really did think of my opening as a trick in some ways, because I thought of it as a trick for readers to think maybe that this was going to be one of those grand historical narratives, right? Like, oh, I'm interested in learning about this big historical event. But what the reason I wanted to write about this, you know, enter through this historical event at all, was because I felt I've always felt like this sort of disconnect, this dissonance between the ways that we read about history in history books, or like learn about them in documentaries, or even see it happening on the news, and the way that you live it as an individual consciousness, right? And for me, in my childhood especially, that this was really acute because because I was learning about Chinese history from like a Western perspective, but I was at the same time hearing stories from my family members, and it took me a really long time to even realize that some of these stories were about the same thing, because the tone and the feeling of the stories was so different, right? So I think the reason I kept that opening even after I found out that the novel was going to be a lot more intimate, was because I wanted to write about, you know, history happening, but from the point of view of an individual consciousness, and not someone who's you know, a major figure, but someone whose life just sort of brushes against history and is perhaps shaped by it, like all of our lives inevitably are, but, you know, sort of communicate and convey the dailiness of living, and also, you know, the pettiness and the ways in which people are driven by their little desires and pains and joys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that that's absolutely what you captured in writing about the Tiananmen Square massacre. And I have that exact mirrored experience of, you know, hearing stories from my family, and even, you know, going to Tiananmen Square myself whenever I visit my grandparents over the summer, and just not being able to, you know, combine that with the pictures of the tanks, you know, that is iconic, right? That's the only picture really that, you know, I tied to those massacres that I think most people tend to. And it was just really difficult for me to actually mesh those things together until I started to think, like, what a square even means, right? If you strip it of the nationality, right? A square is just a public gathering space. We have squares in Ann Arbor, in like every city, every country. And yeah, protests happen there because that's where people gather. But also other activities are happening all the time. And I think what you're saying about, you know, how kind of grand history can be, and yet how the lived experience of history is so much more intimate because, you know, history being necessarily retrospective, you don't actually know that you're making history until someone later tells you you've made history. Right. If you even think about, you know, somebody who's setting a personal best in Olympic sprinting, right? They don't know when they've crossed that finish line that they just, you know, suddenly broke the world record. They just finished the race. That's the only thing that they're thinking about. And I think that's what you really captured when you write about the massacre, and how you even just refer to the square as the square. And I think that was a really interesting thing that you were able to capture. And in general, the ways in which, you know, the personal and the political intersect throughout your book is just so impressive to me. And I wanted to highlight, you know, one idea that you have repeating both in the personal and the political realm, which is this idea of the past needing to be erased, or a desire to erase the past, but also, you know, the consequence then of an erased past coming back into the present and repeating itself. And you have that in the political realm because China, you know, as a country has this politically fraught relationship with its past. And the kind of political agenda of the Communist Party was a separation from the, you know, traditional and what they considered backwards superstitions and practices of the past, going into a more modern age, you know, unhindered by those trappings. But then on the, you know, personal realm, you have so many characters who are actively erasing or remaking their pasts. Not just Sulan, but also her, you know, her friend Zhang Bo, her husband Yongzong. They're all in some ways trying to remake their past. And, you know, I wanted to just hear you talk a little bit more about what you were trying to explore about the relationship a person and maybe a nation has with its past.
Yeah, I think that when you first think of the idea that you can sort of let go of your past and remake yourself, it's like almost exhilarating, right? It's like freeing and exhilarating. It's sort of like, it's also, it, like you said, it's definitely that sort of mentality that the past can be erased and the bright new future can be, you know, built on top of it, has definitely been a reigning ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. But it's also, you know, sort of, it's also like the driving force of any revolutionary idea, right? Like that we don't have to, because so much of tradition and history has been oppressive, and so to think that you can live or construct a future without really honoring an oppressive past can at first be an extremely liberating thing. And I think that's what my characters are drawn to, right? It's sort of, it's easy and it's exciting to think that you don't have to be bound by where you were born, the circumstances of your birth. But for Sulan, it becomes sort of a pathology almost, right? And I think it can, you know, whatever people think about governments doing enacting that, if that's pathology as well, because it's it's not that simple.
Right.
But yeah, and the other thing that I was thinking about a lot, or not so much consciously while I was writing the book, but afterwards when I started talking about it more, was that another big theme in the book is the demolition of the old Shanghai neighborhoods. And that, you know, that policy of urbanization is very much a reflection of that as well, that you know, historic neighborhoods can just be completely razed, and we can build these beautiful shining new shopping malls with luxury with all the luxury purses you could desire inside, to charge forward into a bright new future. Yeah, I think it's a very seductive but problematic way of trying to live.
Right, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting that you speak of pathology when it comes to Sulan's approach to the past, because, you know, one line that really jumped out to me when I was reading is when, you know, she becomes pregnant with her daughter, and she comments that the responsibility of a parent to their unborn child is keeping your history from infecting the child, which is such powerful and almost perverse language when you think about, you know, inheritance, when you think about the kind of natural cycles that with every generation you pass down what happened to you to the generation after. Whether that's spoken or it's secret, something still gets passed through. And so in her, you know, desire to really essentially give her child the cleanest slate possible, she strips Leah of her past, and that's what sends Leah off, you know, on that journey. So then the question is, you know, what is it about a lack of a past that equals a clean slate, do you think, for Sulan? Because I wouldn't necessarily, you know, synonymize those two things together.
Yeah, well, I think for someone like Sulan, because she feels so like just ashamed of her origins, that's what she wants to like wipe clean, really, is her shame, right? And the only way she knows how to do it is by just wiping the entire thing clean. I guess, you know, in the language of like psychotherapy, you could call it repression. Yeah.
I think that I'm glad you brought up the word shame, because at one point when I was trying to come up with questions, I just had that word in all caps because I was like, I need to come up with a question.
Oh, no.
But I think that, I mean, I love the ways in which you explore shame as this totally hidden thing that is kind of, that feels very internal to the characters who are able to transform themselves on the outside as seeming like people who transcended the peasant class or whatever class it was that they came from. And Zhangbo, who I've mentioned earlier as one of Sulan's classmates, also very, very, you know, intelligent, at some point talks about, you know, the shame and the anxiety that comes simply from being very poor, right? In some ways it is as simple as that. And it's a hidden shame that they share. It's what allows these two characters to feel that, you know, they can be fully themselves with each other, which is something that ultimately pushes one away and attracts the other, which is another interesting thing that you're able to, you know, divulge for us. But on the other hand, the other classmate that I've mentioned, Yongzong, who is Zhangbo's best friend, who ends up being the husband of Sulan, he grew up well off, and he can't see at all, you know, the shame that they're apparently holding on to. And in general, he, you know, is spoken of as someone who doesn't have the ability to see beyond himself, because he is just that kind of selfish that comes from, you know, growing up with all the privileges of a family that's educated and where you're the only son, and the only thing you ever have to do is just, you know, get the right kind of degree. And, you know, this kind of invisibility seem to operate on the same level as the laws of physics that Sulan is also so intrigued by, and that is also just threaded throughout this book. You know, this level of, you know, things that are invisible to the eye that still have a great and sometimes terrible effect on people and the world around them. And so I had a question of, what was your book trying to explore about this kind of power of invisibility, whether that be shame or whether that be, the laws of physics governing how our world works. What is it about the invisible and the hidden that can be so powerful?
I think for me, that's just what draws me to literature, right? I I think of myself as a storyteller, but I think that like in our current day and age, there are so many wonderful forms of storytelling that show what is visible, um, and 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 yet, watching a good movie or a really riveting TV show that's really, smart and exciting and moving, um, it doesn't have the same effect on me as reading a book that's exactly what I want to read. It doesn't have, because what I feel um, language and, language intentionally used can do is is to sort of articulate those abstract and invisible things, as you say. And I think that, I'm also very drawn as a person and as a writer to the to the feeling of not transcendence necessarily, but the feeling of like something else other than the parent world, right? And and because we live in sort of a secular world, there's not really great language for it. But I feel like the struggle of trying to put that into language is one of the reasons that I write.
Right. Absolutely. I think you've put that very difficult to articulate thing about how difficult it is to articulate really well. And speaking of something that, is difficult to get down into writing, your dealings with dialect were really fascinating to me because, for one, you have sort of different varieties of dialects, which already have their different kind of cultural privilege or baggage. There's the kind of urban, semi-exclusive Shanghainese, which I've always thought of as a rather, exclusive dialect that, only fancy people can speak. Yeah. And then there's the much less acceptable dialects that come from rural villages. And in both cases, these are, in their dialectical quality, they're really not written down, especially the ones that come from the rural villages. And I wanted to hear you talk about your experience of portraying something that is usually only ever experienced in, the invisibility of speech and just, auditorily hearing it and actually trying to capture that in the written word.
Yeah. I mean, part of it was just realism, I think when I started writing, I was like, how am I going to write all of these things? It's impossible. These characters can't even communicate with each other because they're same dialect. And then at one point I realized, oh, I can just write that. I can just write that into the story, into the text, that they can't understand each other because they're not speaking the same dialect. Quite surprisingly, one of the books that really helped me figure out how to write this was Ben Lerner's Leaving the Tocha Station. Oh. Have you read it?
No, I haven't. That's so interesting.
It's about a dude who's living in Spain. And there are all these moments when the failure of communication and of understanding becomes a source for more rather than less meaning, right? Misunderstanding. There were just points when I read it a really long time ago, but the narrator would say something like, oh, this person said this, or maybe this, or maybe this. And like, then instead of one thing, you have three things and it's more meaning, right? So I realized after reading that that I could use the misunderstandings and failure of communication to generate more meaning. And another reason that I wanted to write about dialect is just because it's something that feels like language feels very emotional to me, right? But so does dialect. When I think of my grandmothers, my various family members who mostly speak to me in a certain dialect that I have whatever percentage of comprehension in, my love for them and my feeling for them is bound up in the sound of that language and like the special turns of phrase that exist only in that dialect. Like for example, with one of my grandmothers, the only words I really know how to say in the dialect are "please no more food," which is very much bound up in my relationship with her and the way she exists in my memory and my mind.
I think that makes a lot of sense that, dialects, as with all language, but I think specifically because of how much smaller the amount of people speaking and how it is so location based, the dialect that you speak, that it's totally rooted in context makes a lot of sense to me, because I remember, overhearing my father speak to his mother on the phone in a language that I just didn't know because it wasn't Mandarin. And I had so little context for any other language outside of Mandarin that I just told everyone for years that my father knew Cantonese, because that was my only context for any other language that could be, something that my father might speak, because the idea of dialect was so outside of my realm of what language could be. I didn't yet understand, the region that he grew up in and the smallness of the town where he was raised, and the way in which language, organically changes when a small group of people are together for long, like centuries and that much time. Language, like anything organic, evolves and changes. So I do want to start to open up to other questions, but I want to get people a chance to type whatever it is that they would love to ask Meng about her great book. So I'll ask another question while people are thinking up something clever. So on the topic of language, one of your characters, who I've mentioned, Yongzong, who is rather mediocre, and it's what I really like about him as a character, even as that's also the most frustrating thing about him. He, despite his mediocrity, has a wonderful facility with foreign languages, and it's this facility that, in some ways, gives him a secret pocket of brilliance that his wife Sulan doesn't have, because she actually really struggles with the nuanced linguistic patterns that occur within that discipline. And she's just so much more comfortable with the harder rules of science. And, your book has really wonderfully blended language and science together, even as it kind of puts them at odds with each other and the different kind of rules of each realm. How did you see the interplay between these two disciplines, right? Does a facility with one really warp you against the other, or are you actually seeing much more of a relationship between the two, kind of a opposite Maxwell demon situation?
Yeah, I think my desire to write about science was similar to, that desire to write about history that I mentioned earlier, which was that the sound that like scientific writing had in my head when when I thought about it in like popular culture, didn't sound the same as it sounded inside my head, if that makes sense. I have a very light scientific background, in the sense that once upon a time I took science classes in college, and fancied perhaps being a physics major. But I still, I still find a lot of beauty in scientific concepts, and especially physics concepts. And when I was writing this book, I was reading a lot of these sort of popular science books about physics, just because sometimes when I'm writing fiction, it's easier to read nonfiction. And like these are books like Carlo Rovelli's 7 Brief Lessons in Physics, or Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. And there were moments where I felt like I was just reading it like I was reading poetry, where I wasn't so interested in comprehension so much as just inhabiting a new landscape of language. And at the same time, revisiting some of the concepts that I studied when I was younger, it reminded me of how pleasurable it was to learn about those things in the first place, how pleasurable it was the first time that I was able to replicate the proof for relativity, for example. And that memory of that pleasure gave me a desire to write about it. And Carlo Rovelli's work in particular, I felt like he did such a good job. He wrote about physics so beautifully. And like he would, quote Dante when he was talking about physics, and that helped show me that it was possible to write about science in a way that didn't just feel like technical or like science.
No, I can totally resonate from what you're saying about the poetics of physics and scientific language. I remember my mother used to always say that like physicists were always like the sexiest scientists because they're thinking about the world and the universe was always just like so much more magical. But also my father used to be a physicist, so I feel like she was biased. All right, so we have a couple of questions, which is fantastic. First one from Alexandra. Did you have all of the characters in mind going into the writing of the novel, or did any of the characters come as a surprise to you as you were working?
Yeah, Yeonjong's character was a surprise to me. I didn't know I was going to write his perspective. I actually wasn't really interested in him for a very long time. And I wrote him sort of like as an exercise of research into my imagination, because I was like, okay, well, he's definitely an important character and I need to know what happens to him and what's going on with him, even if my readers don't. But then I started to write him and it came out so naturally. And he was actually the first person I wrote in first person. And it made sense to write him in first person because he's somebody who's telling himself a story that's different from maybe the story that readers will see. And that, that actually opened something up for me. It opened up the structure of the novel because I realized that the parts of Sulan that he was seeing were so different, right? So it gave me a sense that I could write about a person from these sort of fractured, perspectives that didn't quite add up to a sort of neat whole.
It's so interesting to hear that was your very first person perspective. And the reasoning behind it makes total sense. That's always what's hindered me from writing first person, is that question of, well, why are they telling the story, right? Because there's always a reason when it's first person. And I think that makes so much sense to me. Another question is, do you agree with the comparison of your novel to Asymmetry?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Do you agree? I think it's like sort of like structurally weird. I think that, Lisa Halliday has like a sort of like cerebral voice that I also have. I think that novel's a lot like more interested in being like witty than mine is. And obviously we're dealing with a lot of different themes.
And another question is, when it comes to the themes of ambition, family, shame, etc., was there anything you were afraid or nervous to approach in this book?
Um, I can't really think of anything in particular. I think that, writing is scary in itself. So I was probably just afraid of it all.
Yeah,
Like
every
either
day a
every
new
or
terror.
nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, today I was terrified of writing something in internet speak. And then the day before, I was terrified about trying to describe, um, I don't know, some kind of sexual act. Like every day, it's just some
Yeah.
new thing that you're scared of doing. um, and another question is, do you have a favorite character or a character whose perspective you especially loved writing from?
Hmm. I think my favorite character is Sung-ho, and that's why I didn't write from his perspective because I wanted to leave him alone. um, but I enjoyed writing Zulwin's sections the most. And I rewrote her sections many times because the early drafts were very slow and detailed, which is what I enjoy writing. But yeah, people told me I should try to make them a little less slow and detailed, especially since she opens the book.
Yeah, I mean, I love Sulan as a character. She's the neighbor essentially to Sulan, and kind of raises Leah in the first couple of years of her life, and she's fantastic. She's just in some ways her own kind of brilliant, ambitious woman, though she was unable to transform in the way that Sulan was able to. So the kind of ways in which they mirror each other and how they see each other as mirrors is just another one of the amazing things that your book does. Like, I need to stop carrying on about it. And, when you're thinking about, the advice that you get, right, from other people, because you just mentioned that that was something that you were kind of pushed to do, was to kind of leave that comfort zone of meditative writing and to go and bring more pace or adventure or what have you into the mix. Did you find that there was any piece of advice that was either really great that you're glad that you listened to even though you resisted it, or advice that you're glad that you resisted because it allowed you to stay true to your vision?
I mean, there's probably so much that I ignored that I don't remember anything in particular. I mean, like just not necessarily about this book in particular, but when I was starting out writing, I had a writing teacher who was like, just put more Chinese stuff in it. And like that kind of, the Chinese stuff is good. And like, yeah, I ignored that and anything of that sort of vein. I think one of the last pieces of advice that I got from my agent that I think really just pushed the book to the next level was that originally it was 3 novellas founded by these more or less different, more or less the same versions of what is currently the beginning and the end. I at first was very adamant about it. I was like, there are like 3 planets orbiting a black hole. And the first section was Suwin section, which was slower than it is now. Mm-hmm. And I think my agent was mostly worried that people wouldn't get through Suwin section. And she suggested, like, what if you just thought about, breaking them up? And when I thought about it, I realized that every section had a natural break that I was sort of overworking to make continuous. And that I like, it was sort of this thing where like you like re-envision it and suddenly the pieces fit together. And it solved other problems that I felt like the book was struggling to overcome. And that was a piece of advice that I was very grateful to have.
Man, I get like vicariously tingly whenever I hear about like that kind of coincidental advice that just solves so many issues. It's just like the magic that every writer is hoping for to come into their lives at the thorniest parts of their drafts. So I think we have time for one more question. And let's see. So now that the book has been out in the world for a while, and you've been able to absorb readers' interpretations of your characters, are there any characters you perceive differently now, be it their fears, motivations, etc.?
I don't know. I think I know all of them a little better. You know, like when I'm writing, I don't think very consciously about things like theme or even character motivations or like I never really voiced that. Like I never said like, oh, my characters are running from their past. So like Sulan, I never said that about her to myself. But in the process of talking about it and hearing readers talk about it, talk about the book, I've actually learned a lot about the book and also about the things that I was obsessed with when I was writing the book. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the rare gift of book tour that you like are reintroduced to the book that you wrote.
Yes.
Well, thank you, so much for making us a part of your book tour. It was such a pleasure to get the chance to read this book and then to be able to ask you questions and pick your brain about just how you came up with these super lived-in characters and these super expansive ideas about the past, about history, about physics. You taught me physics, which is already just such an accomplishment. And so, I'm sure that Bennett has something to round up the end of this event neatly with. But I just want to say, it was such a pleasure, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and will enjoy this book as much as I did as well.
Thank you, Lillian, for your very deep reading.
I told you I had questions.
Your very thoughtful questions.
Yeah, that actually is once again, Lillian, you've had the best wrap up ever for an event. So great. Thank you so much, Meng Jin, for joining us for tonight and being our feature author. Thank you, Lillian, for chatting with her. If you'd like to pick up a copy of either author's book, I'm just going to show them again so you can see them. Little Gods came out earlier this year in January, or Lillian's book, #1 Chinese Restaurant. Please feel free to head to the website. Both are available through our web store there.